It is a huge honour to be welcoming Danny Dorling to give this lecture today. As many of you already know, Danny is a professor in the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford. He's without doubt one of the country's leading experts on inequality, poverty and the cost of living. And Danny's lecture today is going to touch on these themes, I think talking across some of his most recent books on 7 children, peak injustice and the next crisis. But I'm delighted to welcome Professor Danny Dorling to the stage for his presentation, and we'll take questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and thank you everybody for coming. I want to try to convince you that there are many issues which are really interesting, which are actually geographical. So I'm going to talk about crises, I'm going to talk about inequality, and I'm going to end by talking about children. I'm going to try and do it in 35 or 40 minutes even, because I'm most interested in your questions about these topics. Crises. Crises seem to come on us again and again and again, ever more quickly. These men and one woman behind me are now some of the very richest people on earth. One of them wrote a little computer program when he was at university to turn a university Facebook into something that was digital. There was nothing clever about that program. He was just at the right time in the right place, and his family had some money to help him set up a company which became Facebook. Similar with Elon Musk, nearest to me. These people are not demigods with brains the size of planets. And they were not in charge 20 or 30 years ago. Then we had different companies were the largest companies in the world, often oil companies. Or, if you look at the top 10 companies in the US about 20 years ago, Walmart was there, which essentially is a large car park, we call it Asda, with a shop in the middle. So connected with oil. This lot are at the top at the moment, and it's scary because Elon Musk has a wealth which is roughly equal to the wealth of the poorest half of all Americans. I think in future we'll have a word for this kind of inequality, and it won't be a nice word, and it won't be anything that anybody is proud of. But at the moment we kind of accept it. What I'm trying to suggest to you is that we can be optimistic about many of these things because they change. It always changes. And not least because they're very human. They're looking at their phones just as you look at your phone. Crises. You may think that you have grown up in a time of crisis. Right. Most of you were born in the only European country to leave the EU, after spending many, many years deciding whether it would or not. So you have no right to live and work on most of this continent. We took that away from you. None of you had a vote. Then a pandemic comes along and you all have to go out of school for months and for years, despite the fact that your chances of actually knowing you've got COVID are near to zero because of your ages. But the inquiry is happening as we speak about children and literally what happened to you. A war in Ukraine, trade tariffs, Trump coming up for the second time as president, numerous prime ministers. You probably are the first generation since the 1920s to have had so many prime ministers of your country in so few years. You know, that's crisis. But this graph, and if you can't see it, goes from 1800 to 2019, is about the frequency of the use of the word crisis in English language publications. But it's similar in other languages. And a key point is that the use of the word was very low, for decade after decade after decade. Decade after decade after decade, in which there were many wars in Europe, in which there were many epidemics and pandemics, constantly. Cholera, tuberculosis, the ending of plague, flu pandemics in Well, 1918, a huge one, but before then, in the late 1880s, in 1957, in 1968, in 1977, flu pandemics. But they got smaller. And a number of pandemics reduced. You're often told that we're going to get more diseases because there are more of us. We've actually had less. Before COVID-19, the last pandemic was AIDS. We have fewer wars, fewer crises, fewer bad harvests, but more use of the word crisis. The use really picks up in the 1970s. And just before with the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s. And then you'll see spike after spike after spike. We know it's going to spike up absolutely because that graph ends in 2019. And if you can remember 2019, at the end of 2019 we got a little report about some disease in Wuhan. Right? Always starts off as small. There are many things that happen which aren't really crises, but we tend to think of crises. They're bad planning. This is an article from the Guardian newspaper last week about the low birth rate in England possibly leading to 800 primary schools closing in London. One of the schools that you might have gone to might be threatened with closure. Now, this isn't a story of crisis, in a way. This is a story of really bad planning, very bad demographic statistics, not actually knowing that this is going to occur. It's not that hard to count children. And also a certain sadness in that increasingly families with small children cannot afford to live in London. But it's something that's just happening. It is not a sudden crisis. Too many words there, but if you want to know where that picture I started off came from, that gives you the reference to it. And the text just tells you about the oscillation of their fortunes, just of how quickly their money can go down and their money can go up. Right. Just because the super rich of the world have so much now doesn't mean that they always will. But interestingly, they want to buy the social media that you use. And in particular, you'll have noticed over the last few months, they really want you to press that AI tool. Right? They really do. They want you to write in the morning, what should I do with my hair, to your AI friend. They want you to use the AI to help you with your homework. They want you to use it for everything. They're not doing that out of the goodness of their heart. They're not providing you with free access at the moment to this really expensive technology that's going to usually increase your personal carbon footprint because the cost of actually generating the answer for you is very high, because they like you. They want to get information about you. And that's the current crisis that we have. Why do they want to get information about you? Because this is a source of future profit. It's seen to be a way in which people with a lot of money can get more money. Here's a graph of the distribution of wealth in the US, UK, Sweden and France, and how much wealth a small proportion of people had, the top 1%. And you'll see that it actually came down and down and down over the course of the last century to get to a minima in the 1980s, and then only really quite slight rises. But that was the wealth of the top 1%. The kind of people who had a few million and more. What's happened most recently, and what I think is really interesting and in a way heartwarming, well, not necessarily, but useful, is it's only the very, very richest who are getting richer. And politically, that is quite hard to sustain. When your parents were young, there was a Prime Minister called Margaret Thatcher. And she was elected in 1979. And she was elected again in 1983 and 1987, and then stood down, and her friend, John Major, was elected in 1992. One reason that they were elected again and again is that the best off third of people in this country became much better off while she was in power. We became dramatically more unequal, as I'll show you, but a third of adults became richer. And politically, when that happens, it isn't that hard to win elections if you've actually made people better off. What's happening now, and what's been happening for a couple of decades, is nothing like that. And I find that interesting and heartwarming, because I worry when one group gets more and more and more, and that group is large enough for their vote to matter. And this may be one reason why they want you to use AI, because if we're going to carry on having democracy, but most of you are going to lose out, we really need you not to be thinking about that. I'll have a slide later on conspiracy theories for you. I like data. Data gets me away from waving my arms too much, and you can see already where I'm coming from politically. But data is useful for just getting a sense of reality. These three graphs all come from major publications. I think the first appeared in the Atlantic magazine in the US, the middle one in the Financial Times, and I forget where the last one was published. The first one, I've got little dots so I can show you, is about your chance of dying each year, according to your age, if you're living in the United States as compared to other rich countries. And if you're your age, you're twice as likely to die every year. Small chance, but doubled if you're in the USA. But by the time you get to your 20s and 30s, can you see it going up to over 4 times more likely? And then it comes down, but it's always higher than 1 until you get to around about 100. This isn't disputed, this is well known. This appears in a US magazine about the United States. And this is inherently geographical. We're comparing the United States to other rich countries. It's a geographical comparison. It's caused because there are more deaths on the road in the United States. Why are there more deaths on the road? They've got a sensible speed limit. Because they haven't got enough buses and trains, and people are driving everywhere all the time. You're going to get more deaths on the road if you don't have decent public transport. It's caused by more guns. Americans are shocked often when they come to Britain and find that we don't let people carry guns around in Britain. Sadly, the majority of the gun deaths are actually people with guns shooting themselves. You really don't want guns. But also drug overdoses, fentanyl, diseases of despair, and so on. The US does very badly geographically. The middle graph is showing data on life expectancy for the populations of the US and England, where people have been divided from the 1% poorest to the 1% richest. So each little dot is a percentile of the population. Now, England has a low life expectancy in Europe. Most European countries do better than we do. But if you look, here's our richest 1%, and they're living about 86 years, which is the same as the richest 1% in the USA. The USA spends enormous amounts of money on healthcare, mostly private, 60% of its GDP, I think. And most of that is spent by the very richest trying to live longer. And it's quite incredible that net, for the top 1%, it's not actually helping them live that much longer. This is all good news. If it was the case that you could take more money and have a much happier life and a healthier life, it would be bad news for the rest of the population who weren't very good at getting lots of money. The last graph is comparing countries and life expectancy over time and just showing you the difference. And there's the USA. And also, if you want to know how to handle a COVID pandemic badly, that's handling a COVID pandemic badly. This is the depressing part of the lecture. We'll try and get more cheery later. Wars. Now, remember I said we used to have lots and lots of wars, and we did have lots of wars, particularly in Europe. And we had world wars. And then after the Second World War, there were many, many civil wars. But the number of deaths from war actually began to fall in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. And, a man called Steven Pinker wrote a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, saying that we're becoming less violent, and then a bit sadly the rate of war deaths rose, not hugely, but it rose in the last 2 decades. This is a cartogram. Each country is a circle. The circle is sized by the number of people who've died in war or warlike situations as measured by very dedicated, mainly Swedish academics over many, many years. And if you look, there's Afghanistan, there's Syria, there's Rwanda, which was a massacre, but you can see many other countries, all sized up until I think it's 2022. And I'll let you look at the pattern yourself and think, what does it show you? But one key thing is, this is where the deaths occurred. It is not where the weapons were made that killed the people who died. Okay? And it's very, very geographical. Okay? And again, what's going to happen in future? Just as I've suggested that people might look back at a situation in which one man could have a wealth the same as half of the United States, when people look back at that map of war deaths since 1989, since the Berlin Wall fell, what were they going to think in aggregate about this? Who was playing what kind of game? It used to be called the Great Game, that the great powers played over different parts of the world. We're in the right place for that. The RGS goes back to the 1830s, I think, yep. So a club for explorers and imperialists and empire. But that map shows you, in a way, we aren't over that yet. I've just some COVID statistics for you. I won't say much about them, but we've got the inquiry on at the moment. The UK, if you want to be proud of things, there are a number of things you can be proud of the UK, but one is we are better than any other country in the world at collecting data about COVID. But I'll say no more on that. The most important graph, I think, if you want to understand the UK from my point of view, is this one, which starts in 1910, ends about 2020. The top line is the take of the best off 1% of the 1%. The highest income 1 in 10,000 people. Just over a century ago, it was 400 times average income. So if you imagine that a servant is getting paid half average income, somebody who might be a scullery maid and so on, half the average of a worker. If you're in the top 1% of the 1% just over a century ago, you can afford to have 200 servants and still have 200 times average income to play with. And you can run a country house. And they did. And that's why this country has country houses. But the income and the wealth of the rich fell and fell and fell for many reasons, and it did across Europe, and it even did in the United States, just took a bit longer, so that by the 70s, the best off 1% of the 1% only had about 30 times average income. Couldn't run a country house anymore. In fact, servants almost disappeared. The country that you're living in, the UK, by the time I was your age, had become the second most equitable large country in Europe. Sweden was the most equitable. I grew up in a Scandinavian country called England, right, where the social gaps between people had narrowed to a point that had never been seen before. We weren't living in a utopia. There was all the hangovers of the past, right? So people talked with different accents and so on. But I was lucky. I would have failed the 11 plus. I couldn't read until I was 8, which doesn't give you much chance at 11. I'd have failed the 11 plus, but luckily for me, they had abolished it just before I was 11, right? I got to grow up at a time when people didn't necessarily know what a good or a bad school was, because they just made all the grammar schools and the secondary moderns the same. And so for a brief period of time in the city I grew up, which is a little place called Oxford, you just went to the nearest school because there was no point. And if you're interested in this kind of thing, in the case of Oxford, the bottom state school was in the north of Oxford. It was a secondary modern. It had one famous alumni. Her name was Yasmin Le Bon, and she became famous because she married Simon Le Bon. Duran Duran means nothing to you. And the top state school was in the south and was the county grammar school. All made comprehensives, they flipped. In my lifetime, the Tatler recommended state school in my city is Charwell in the north, which was the bottom, and the school which ranks lowest in exam results is the one which was the highest. Things changed dramatically in a short amount of time. We tend to think they don't, but look at that graph. Look how we went from being so unequal to so equal, and then inequality rose again, so that the UK became almost certainly now the most unequal country by income in Europe. Bulgaria is always trying to beat us, but it's just Bulgaria. This is a still from the film Brideshead Revisited, which is really worth looking at to get a sense about inequality in the 1920s and 1930s. We look at films like that now and think, well, that was the past, people couldn't live like that. But we have the same statistical inequalities now. It's just that people don't build great big houses in the countryside. Right? They have apartments in London overlooking various monuments that might cost £2 or £3 or £4 million and have 2 beds. We don't have servants, we have Deliveroo drivers. Right? We don't have servants, but we have school teachers who cannot afford to have children in the cities where they are teachers. One thing that made people hate being servants more than anything else was the fact that you couldn't have a child if you were a servant. There was a survey done of occupations in the past that found out that the one job that people would not recommend their children to do was to be a servant when we had servants. Now, you know that inequality is a problem if you get to a point when people cannot have children and do their job. Remember at the start I showed you those 800 primary schools possibly closing in the next 4 years in London. This is Lady Marchmont from Brideshead, from the film. Imagine how it felt from her. She's looking unhappy because she's already 20 years down that graph. Her income came from her investments overseas. It's Geographical. It's plantations. The investments were not behaving well. That's decolonisation occurring. All right? At some point, she'll have had to give the house to the National Trust as a way of avoiding inheritance tax. Let's go on to some other topics very quickly. About 10 more minutes and then I'll stop. Climate emissions. Other things people worry about. This is the carbon emissions going up over time. And I'm showing you this graph because it's a traditional graph, but you may not notice the wiggles, and the wiggles are interesting. So little dots got to the top, we've got about 35 billion tonnes. Same graph, same data, different way of drawing it. We put time inside the graph. The vertical axis is exactly the same. It's going to go just over 35 billion tonnes of carbon, just before the pandemic. But now we're emphasising how much it goes up and down a year using the horizontal axis. And you can see that in recessions, it actually goes down. It's possible for carbon to go down. It's just you can't have carbon going down and an economy going really, really fast. Or at least not a certain kind of economy. Let's zoom on again. Population. Here's an incredible change, and there have been incredible change. I got an A at A-level geography. I'm very proud of my A at A-level geography. To get an A at A-level geography, I had to describe the ice age that was coming and how the world was going to cool down. And I wrote about it, and then they gave me my A. Because people thought there was an ice age coming in 1984, when I did my A-level geography. You get taught about population. The standard population graph is this one, of a runaway train. Look at it going up and up and up. If you're going to read one book as a result of me talking, read this one, which isn't by me. It's called After the Spike. It's just come out. Partly it's new and it shocked me. It's written by 2 very nice economists from the University of Texas. And it's about what's going to happen to population if things carry on as they are. And you're going to see population max out at about 10 billion by the year 2080, possibly earlier, possibly less than 10 billion, and then go down and down and down and down. You're already part of a declining cohort. Peak baby was 1990, the children born in 1990. There was a little peak 20 years later in 2010, but that was just the babies of those babies, and it was just the same size. And since then, it's gone down and down and down. So we're getting fewer people in future. You'll have seen Hans Rosling, so I hope your teachers have shown you Hans Rosling. You hopefully know that the only reason we're going from 8 billion to 10 is annoying people like me, hopefully from my point of view, not dying in the next 10 years of a heart attack. Right? It's oldies living longer is why the population is going up, not more babies. Here's the world population graph drawn using that technique I showed you for carbon, just to show how the change has been. This data is from about 8 years ago, from the UN, and already we're 500 million lower. Every couple of years the UN publishes new estimates, and we find that people are having fewer and fewer children. I'm going to show you the same graph drawn a different way, just quite quickly. Apologies for the speed, but for people who get bored of graphs, at least I'm going through fairly quickly. Here's the same graph, but on a log scale. And I like really simple stories now. And when I saw this, it never actually drops. World population never falls. I don't think it even fell at the time of the Black Death, because the majority of people in the world were living in isolated villages or not much else in the middle of nowhere. But it fell after 1492, when Columbus took 3 little boats across the Atlantic, and we took our germs to the New World and possibly killed 60 million people. Or the acceleration fell. It fell after 1820. This is closer to home, when we went around the world imposing our systems on, in the case of the UK, I think we invaded 90% of the current members of the United Nations and imposed an empire upon them. That has a disturbing effect on population. At first, you get fewer children, but then, because the social controls of the systems that people live in have gone, you get an explosion. And you go from 1 billion to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6. If you want something to blame for why we got so many people, well, that's not a problem. It was colonisation that kicked off. But now we have a fall which is caused by people, principally women, having power over their own lives. That is hardly falling worldwide. This is getting better in more countries and getting worse. The country in which it's getting worse is the United States. But the United States is only 4% of the world's population. I've got Greta and Elon and Donald there because they have different views about these things. A political graph about Britain compared to the rest of Europe for you. This is IMF data on the percent of GDP spent on public goods. Public goods, healthcare, pensions, schools, the army, anything the government spends on. It's very similar to the rate of taxation, give or take a bit of borrowing. Now the UK is the red line. It goes up. I'll tell you what the spikes are in a minute, but in general it goes up. So when they tell you that taxation is at a 70-year high, they're telling you the truth. It is at a 70-year high. The spikes, the most recent one is COVID, furlough schemes, paying for that, and the one back in 2008 is bailing out the banks. Right? You need governments for all kinds of things. The private sector needs governments, otherwise we wouldn't have banks anymore. They would have collapsed. But the key thing here is the difference between these countries. Rachel Reeves, who I was warming to this week, because she was getting a bit feisty on the radio, Rachel Reeves, Chancellor of the Exchequer, stands in front of a Labour Party conference and tells people she has to make tough decisions because it isn't possible to do things very different. Now, Rachel didn't do a geography degree. Geographical comparison of spending in different European countries. We could go to Germany, the black line in the middle. In fact, there was a plan to go to Germany. The problem is that they didn't call it going to Germany. But the Labour Party manifesto of 2017 and 2019 was costed so that after 5 years we'll be at the German level of public spending. I just wish they'd said that's what they were doing. Germany spends £1 billion, pounds, or it's euros, but much the same, billion more than we do on healthcare every week. If you remember, there was once talk about 350 million, a billion more. And Germany's in the middle. It's not like France and Belgium and Finland at the top. So huge geographical differences. If you want to get very nerdy about the geography, there were 2 countries that had smaller public sectors than us in the past. They were Spain, shortly after Franco was a dictator, and Greece shortly after the generals were in charge, and again it was a dictatorship. We have a wonderful House of Lords, and countries get it wrong. You can see Sweden up there in yellow, I think. You know, you can get to a point of so much public spending it doesn't quite work and you bring it down again. Sweden is not doing terribly badly at the moment, certainly spending more than Germany. These differences might look small, but if you go to another country in Europe and look at how do the schools work, how do the universities work, higher public spending means not making you sign up to a debt of about £30,000, which is going to rise with interest for the privilege of going to university. It means going to university for free in most of Europe, or almost free. Right? These are the differences. It means healthcare where you only have to wait a week or a month rather than a year to be seen. Sometimes the money is squandered. It doesn't always work better. But these are huge differences between European societies. And they've occurred because after all of Europe became more equal, it then went in different directions. We became the most unequal. The best off got the most. And places like Finland and Sweden became the most equal. And as a result, you get these different policies on public spending and taxation. 2 quotes for you to read. Less than 5 minutes away from the end. I promise. I may sound, I don't know, because I think when you get to a certain age, I'm 57, you don't sound radical anymore. But I may sound radical or angry, but I'm kind of old and sometimes think I'm not. Stephanie Flanders, whose father wrote Mud, Mud, Glorious Mud for the older people in the audience. Stephanie Flanders, Chief Economic Correspondent of Bloomberg. John Byrne Murdoch, Financial Times. This is bad news. You are living in a very poor country, but a very divided country. And you're living in one of the boom parts of it. And although there are poor parts of London, and some of you may have come from out of London, it's quite possible to live parallel lives in this country where you never see the poverty that, in some cases, almost a majority of, well, in many areas, a majority of children are suffering. It's possible to grow up without seeing this. Which brings me to 7 children. Annoyingly, there are 8 bars on the front of the book. That was the publisher deciding to do that. But the first 7 bars are the actual take-home income after tax and benefits of 7 typical families with children in the UK spread out equally. That is how different we are. And I'm ignoring the top 7 or 8% of society, and I'm ignoring the bottom 7 or 8%. I'm just taking all the children, in this case, that existed in 2018, there were 14 million, dividing them into 7 groups of 2 million, and taking the middle child of each group. 3 or 4 of the 7 are living in poverty, but different experiences of poverty. Right? The poorest child has half the income of the child near the middle, but they're all below a poverty line. About 30% of children have no summer holiday, and repeatedly have no summer holiday. About 30% of parents cannot afford to save £10 a month, or if they can, it's because they've stopped paying for household insurance. Why does household insurance matter? If you have a fire or a flood or theft, in the case of somebody like me, I could afford to replace the goods in my house, mostly. I'd run out of money, but I'd replace them. But I'm a rich university professor. If you do not have money and savings and that happens, you're in trouble. We can go up. If you go up to child number 7, which is just below the N, so she is representative. She's called Gemma, by the way, in this book. Children are real to me, but they're statistical constructs. Child number 7, her parents, after tax, receive £25,000 a year. Their household income is £50,000. They are better off than 6 out of 7 other children. The reason for the 8th bar is that above the top 7th child, you have a group, of which I'm in, with only about 7% of families who have half of all national income. If you go right to the very top and look at percentiles, the top 1% has an average income, their family, of about £600,000 a year. Right? But within the very top 1%, there is even more inequality. It carries on and on, it never ends. Or it ends with Elon and his family. Yeah? And lots of children. It's quite interesting. Right at the very top, you never know how many children they've got. I'll stop there. It wasn't a school lecture, I'd carry on. It's really hard statistically if you don't know how many children you're trying to divide the money up. To cheer you up slightly. This is depressing, but it's good. You can forget the wiggly lines, those are the inequality data, but they're complicated. We're bad. There's Bulgaria. I don't fix things being annoying, but the data ends in 2021. I'm hoping, not really, but, well, for the sake of Bulgaria, hopefully Bulgaria is not quite as bad as it was, and we may be number 1 in Europe when the new data comes out. This is United Nations, UNICEF data on child poverty, the main international data on child poverty for rich countries. It's the change in the percentage of children living in poverty, using an international definition, in the most recent 7 years. And it's really, really good news, because all these countries have seen falls. Poland, almost 40%. Right, Korea, if you remember Parasite or Squid Games, am I getting any of my references right? Squid Games, okay, it's poster country for inequality in the East. Korea, 30% drop in child poverty in 7 years. Canada dropped, Romania dropped, Portugal, Croatia, Japan, Ireland, Greece, Belgium. Even the United States had a drop in this period, quite small. Only a few countries had child poverty rise. And if you go to the very top, they included Iceland, France, Switzerland, Norway, which had some of the lowest rates of child poverty ever measured, but it went up 10%, from one of the lowest points ever measured. And then, and this is geographical because it's comparing countries, the United Kingdom had the biggest recorded rise of any country in the most recent period by the United Nations. A 20% rise of child poverty on a level which was already incredibly high for Europe. And we have a budget coming up, and there is a choice about what to do about benefits for children. I would say it's not rocket science. We've even been helped, in case you don't know, and you won't know because we're not told, that there is a place in Europe in which they've decided to tackle child poverty. They started a few years ago and gave families who were poor, with a child under 6, £10 a week. In that country, they've now increased it to almost £30 a week for children under 16. A family of 3 who would be receiving any benefits now get £4,000 a year. In this country, no child need go cold or hungry. The policy was agreed by the 2 main political parties in the country so that it's not argued about. And because we don't have enough time, I won't get you to guess the country, but the country is Scotland. So Scotland has the lowest rate of child poverty in the UK and has enacted the policy to achieve that and has done it, with the agreement of the Labour Party and the Scottish National Party together. Right. Geographical. An example of a policy in the UK doing something different. How do they do it? They make somebody like me pay 3 or 4% more tax. Right? It doesn't actually take that much more taxation from wealthy people to avoid children going cold and hungry. I'm going to skip this because I want to know your questions, but these are the kind of things that people worry about the most. Maybe the important thing to point out is that climate change is now number 5 in the world. It's not the biggest worry of most people. It is the biggest worry of most affluent people, and it is a worry. But while we have other issues going on, it's hard to get people to worry about climate change if they're finding it hard to put food on the table. And no time to talk about conspiracy theories, but they are fun, and slightly rude posters. Let's go over that. And go over that, and I'll put my final slide up. And the reason for this is about optimism. It's easy to think that we're in a time of crisis and nothing's going to get better, and the future is terrible, and the AI is going to control you, and our carbon footprints are going to come up, and it's a burning planet, and we've gone past 12 years to save the world, and the grown-ups don't care and they're not in charge. And there is a lot to be said for parts of that often being true. But remember on that graph of child poverty that the majority of countries measured had big falls. And the same has happened in poorer countries where it's measured in a different way. Infant mortality is falling almost everywhere. Life expectancy is mostly rising. People are, in most of the world, living lives which are more free and with greater agency. The rate at which people are being allowed to go to education is accelerating. It can't accelerate forever. I think, well, unless we go to university to the age of 50, but that wouldn't be fun. But it's accelerating at the moment worldwide. This doesn't mean that our degree of worry is falling. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing, because it's good to worry, because if you don't worry about things, they don't get better. These are the 10 commandments of the socialist Sunday school movement, which was mildly big about 100 years ago, and I'm told there's still one in Glasgow somewhere going. You probably don't know what a Sunday school is. You may. I had to go to one. It was on Sunday. I was 6. I can remember colouring in pictures of Jesus with a blue felt tip. And I think my parents got some relief from me. Right? And there used to be these things. These were alternatives. And they had an alternative set of commandments. And at the time, they were seen as radical and dangerous. Now look at them. I challenge you to find anything there that you think is actually just not being nice. Many, many things get better. Many political wins are made. We tend not to count our blessings or notice the things that get better. We tend to worry and be greatly concerned about the things that are bad or which may get worse. The UK right now is in a terrible position. It's in the bottom of the class in Europe for issues of children. But the good news is that when you're doing that badly, it is easy to lift from the very bottom. Harder when you've done the easy and the cheapest things first. But the UK, you'll almost certainly see it changing its ranks over the course of your life and it getting better. My grandfather was a geographer. He was a geography teacher. He was born in 1916, in the middle of a war. All his life, things got better. He was too young to be unemployed in the 30s. He entered the workforce at a time of full employment. He could buy a house like most people could, just a narrow majority, in his 20s and start a family. By the time he was in his 70s or 80s, there was record-breaking investment in the National Health Service for him. He lived to 96. He lived through that period of rapidly growing equality, and the inequality didn't affect him very much because he was a well-off pensioner, because he was a headmaster of a school, having been a geography teacher. You may well have a similar trajectory in your lives, but you won't get it unless you fight for it a little bit. Thank you very much for putting up with me, and please think of some questions.
I'm sure there are going to be questions. So Claire and Alice have got microphones. If you raise your hand, they'll come to you and we can ask some questions. We might take, if there are a lot, we'll take 2 or 3 at a time and Danny will then respond to them.
Do 2 at a time if you get
2 at a time.
Because I can't remember 3.
Okay, 2 at a time. Or we'll just take 1. Who wants to ask the first question? Great. Hit down. Oh, we've got 2 coming. Fantastic. 1 here, and then we'll take the one on the front row.
So at the beginning of the talk, you just showed a Guardian article, and you said that 800 schools are closing due to low birth rates. Besides the cost of living crisis, what other social, economic factors are we neglecting or not thinking about, and what do you think we should put more of a focus on?
Very good question. Yep. One more.
I just had a question on how do you think we should solve this issue of inequality? Because the approach to taxes, I think it doesn't affect the ultra rich because they find so many loopholes. And anyway, within the top 1%, people are just going to move out of the country, so it ends up impacting the people who stay in those. Yeah. So I was just wondering, whether you think progressive taxation is effective.
For doing that, okay. Here is the worldwide list of things that most middle-class people worry about the most, for your question. Cost of living and inequality are actually number 1 and 2. I've put them together here, but they are absolutely up there. Interestingly, and this shocked me, unemployment is number 2. And it shocked me because we don't have particularly high unemployment rates, but people are really worried about unemployment. And it showed me how privileged I was that I was shocked. And you will worry, right? When you are worrying, what am I going to do in 10 years' time? Who's going to want me? Will I get a job? That's a fear of unemployment. So that's number 2. There was a policy announced today, I think, to offer people jobs at a certain age. Not clear. It's always good to make it a choice. We had a thing called the Youth Training Scheme in the 80s, which wasn't a choice. It wasn't good. Then 3 is crime, violence, war in particular, especially if you're near a war zone, as a worry. This was my biggest worry at your age, by the way, because we appear to be absolutely doomed to die in a nuclear war. And then a geographer, it wasn't just him, but a geographer called Stan Openshaw. I don't know if you've heard this one. Stan took the 1981 census. He took the square leg attack plan that government published saying where Russia was going to hit us, and he took the government report of what the effect of a 1 megaton bomb would be. He put the census and the square leg attack plan and the report on the damage from a bomb together in a very early GIS and found out that 30 million people will be dead or dying in 2 weeks. Government, I think, and this part's secret, didn't believe him, so GCHQ ran it and they went, oh no, there will be 30 million people dead or dying in 2 weeks. We're not going to survive a nuclear war. In the next 10 years, the USSR and the USA got rid of 90% of their warheads. And there was a geographer involved in that. These are the things to worry about. And if you don't worry about the things that really matter to people, they're not going to worry about your worries about climate change. Policies to do. In the past, we had higher rates of taxation. And we are doing okay. So they're possible. And other countries have higher rates. You can't just bang in a wealth tax and expect it to work. They tried it in Norway, but Norway is very small. And Oslo is quite boring. And you can see why somebody... Whereas London is big and your life might be centred here. So there have been studies that suggest that we won't lose as many people as some think we lose if we have a little wealth tax. But I'll just introduce it very small and just eke it up. Until you get to a point when wealth inequality stops rising. Because you can't have inequalities just getting bigger and bigger all the time. That gets you a Blade Runner dystopian future. And it's really hard to argue that it's a good thing when you've already got high inequality for it to get bigger and bigger. Unless you believe that people like Elon really are so superhuman intelligent that they deserve all that money, and we're not going to get to Mars without them. Yeah. More questions?
One just
mentioned education, but should we also prioritise healthcare or economic growth also as a way to tackle inequality?
Economic growth hasn't helped very much with inequality, although there are claims that more equal countries actually have higher rates of economic growth, or at least good growth. Certainly the highest number of patents per head more equal countries generate. There's a certain amount of healthcare you just have to pay for out of decency over what you expect to get. But it's much better to create a happier country in which people are less likely to get ill, and then you don't have to pay so much money on healthcare. Education, with just a little nudge in education, and I may be idealistic about this, but I do believe you could improve parts of state education has been massively devalued, something like £2,000 or £3,000 per pupil taken away in the last decade. But a little bit of a nudge, and you could improve state education. Say in my hometown of Oxford, we have 6 state schools, secondary schools. If you merged them all and had one senior leadership team rather than 6, and used the money that you saved to allow you to move teachers between them, so that all your 40-year-olds didn't end up in a Tatler recommended school and all your 21-year-olds didn't end up in the other school. And if you put the science block in one and Russian teaching in another, you could create a school in Oxford, a state school, which would be better in terms of facilities because of its size than the private schools, of which a third of children in Oxford go to. Begin to do that, and in theory it doesn't cost you necessarily any more, and it suddenly alters the balance. The reason I use this as an example is that I went to a school in this city. If I'd gone to Magdalen College School, which still exists, the private school, the nearest school to my school, I would have been 20 times more likely to go to university. 20 times. So it really would have made sense for my parents to send me there if they wanted me to go. Now, the difference is only about 30% more likely. Right? 20 times is like that, 30% is like this. So why are parents still making a choice when the effect is actually so small on what happens? You mostly still end up in Leeds or Manchester University, whether you've paid the money or not. And that's why I think you can nudge on public spending on education. And we and Chile are spending the highest proportion of money on private education in the world. So I would just do little nudges just to make it easier for families, most of whom are spending an absolute fortune to send their children to a school, and often not having holidays. So when we look at the distribution of who is not having holidays, it's the poorest third of children, but also a really interesting little sector who are not having holidays because mum and dad are paying the school fees. And that's a tragedy when it shouldn't be necessary.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time. I promised that we would complete by 6 o'clock. So I'm going to ask you, there is a chance for you to come up and ask questions individually at the end. Okay, so if you've got questions you want to ask, please do come up. But can you join me at this stage in terms of thanking Danny for a very